Our final presenter today is Professor of History Jonathyne Briggs, and his presentation is entitled Autism and Human Rights, Filicide in France and the United States. Jonathyne?
I've been given the enviable position of trying to wrap this up, and I want to thank my colleagues for just fantastic presentations and sharing their research. Some of you may or may not know, I'm currently finishing up a book on the history of autism in France, and sort of one of the things that came out over and over again is this process of filicide. So I kind of wanted to talk about a bit as a case study to get us to kind of think about some of the challenges in ensuring human rights. Okay. So in 2012, Zoe Gross, the director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, launched the Day of Disability Mourning. It's held every March 1st as a recognition of the practice of filicide and its disproportionate impact on disabled populations. So filicide, the murder of a child by their parent or other family member, has a long and unfortunate presence in the history of disability, especially in the cases of autism. Yet, legal outcomes of filicide shows that juries have often exonerated parents, okay? Suggesting that the social value of disabled life was unequal to that of able life. So in the next few minutes, I want to talk about a few specific cases of filicide in two national contexts, France and the United States. And the choice of these two states is deliberate, I promise, as both purport themselves to be protectors of human rights, although tacit acceptance of filicide hints at the limits of these ideas in relation to the disabled. So I'm going to start in November of 1966 in Chambéry, France, where the mother of a disabled infant was brought to trial, accused of murdering him by giving him an overdose of phenobarbital. The mother, Morel Gourand, defended her actions by arguing that her son's life was too much of a struggle and that he was better off being somewhere else, in this case dead, rather than being in this world. That child, Fausto Gourand, was 3 years old and had a number of disabilities since the age of 6 months, including epilepsy and what would likely be classified as autism today. Fausto had been receiving care from several doctors, but this experience had been wearing on his mother, who had lost all hope and sought instead a more permanent solution to his challenges. She was tried before the French Criminal Circuit Court for murder, and during the trial, the prosecution accused her of premeditation. They asked her to explain her actions. And during the trial, she emphasized her son's condition. Quote, "He was mute, he was deaf, his language was paralyzed. It took all my time to care for him," end quote. It was then she decided to empty the phenobarbital into Fausto's milk. She then told the judge that she had to choke her son to complete the act of filicide, as the drug had not killed him. When asked if she could do it again, Gourand replied, quote, "I believe yes. He's fine where he is now," end quote. Despite her confession to the crime, her defense was emotionally compelling to the jury, which deliberated for only 30 minutes before delivering an acquittal for Gourand. Thus, the death of Fausto was justified in this sense from the perspective of French society. This decision was met with horror from some activist groups in France, but autistic people then were considered mentally ill and lacked rights that would protect them. Some advocacy organizations issued heated responses to the decision, equating it with the Nazi response to the disabled, eugenics policies, et cetera, et cetera. International organizations such as the United Nations hoped that they could rectify situations such as this, but national jurisdiction superseded those efforts and cases of filicide continued. In fact, in France, another case captured national attention in the early 1970s when the father of Pascal Faure murdered his son on December 20th of 1970. A warrant for the father was issued and he was placed under arrest, but advocates held little hope that he would be convicted. He actually did eventually get released. And they noted that in France, nine disabled children had been killed by their parents that very year alone, in 1970. So in a period where parents of disabled children were petitioning to improve the lives of their children, their condition, their rights, the phenomenon of filicide shows that some parents chose a different path and that path was found acceptable as an unfortunate necessity, we might say, by French society. At the same time, in the United States, there was a case concerning the murder of a young man named Douglas Gibson. He was a 13-year-old autistic boy who was shot by his father after a failed attempt to put him in an institution. And this case captured national headlines. His father, Alex, in fact, shot him in the head while he was taking a nap, and Douglas would die on the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Okay? So the idea is that filicide is this unfortunate and commonly practiced thing. And in fact, in a collection in 2012, published by the Autistic Network there, they dedicated it to 32 autists who were murdered by their parents between 1993 and 2012. And such cases were often presented as mercy killings, as it was, by the way, in the French trial. In many cases, ironically, or maybe not so much, it's a filicide suicide, where the parent also takes their own life. So, in fact, there were 26 such cases as this reported in the United States between 1982 and 2010. So while filicide impacts all disabled populations, with these cases, over half of the victims were autistic. Media presentations of these cases often frame them as justified due to the parents being overwhelmed by caring for their disabled child. But it reinforced the lesser value of disabled life and illustrated the pervasive nature of that belief in American society. Studies have shown in the United States the risk of premature death in autistic populations is 2 to sometimes 10 times higher than in the general population. And it's not always clear that this population is more vulnerable to filicide. Yet in a recent analysis of media reports of cases of filicide, 52 perpetrators were typically, in these 52 cases, the perpetrators were overwhelmingly parents, okay, 62% of the cases. And of those, by the way, mothers, which is an interesting side note. With the most common means of death being gunshot wounds in the United States. Yet the notion of filicide continues to be seen in kind of this altruistic and merciful way, and the phenomenon continues in the United States and France. So I want to leave you with a more recent case. On January 8th of 2023, Megan Fricks, a 26-year-old autist, was murdered by her father, who then killed himself. Her mother had died in 2019, and her father had been caring for her at home and was struggling with being overwhelmed due to a lack of support services. So Fricks' death, by the way, was just one of several disabled murders in 2023. There are 7 on record, which illustrates that this is a continued issue. But ultimately what it does, it reveals the limits of human rights for disabled people, especially in the justification of their murder, even in nations that purport to protect disabled people equally under the law. Disability advocacy groups argue that the media must recognize its responsibility in how these cases are reported, and often position the parents, presenting them as empathetic and understandable in the reaction to situation, which further diminishes the value of disabled life. Thank you.